Thank you very much, Wendy, and thanks to all of you for being here as we near the end of the conference. When I was a first-year university student, the people who stayed at the party until the very end were called diehards because the battery didn't run out. So you're all the diehards of this conference. And you know, I don't know about you, but as I attend a conference like this with so much intense conversation and so many ideas being thrown around, I just feel as if my brain is becoming heavier and heavier, denser and denser by the end, and it's just hard for me to keep going. I keep wanting to soak up ideas, and yet it's very hard at the end. So I was trying to think of a way to lighten the burden of attending a final plenary session, and so you might want to think of this as an end note presentation as we reach the very end, to try to sound some notes about where we are in this discipline of environmental humanities and ways of reaching outward beyond the intense inwardness of our conversation together for a few days, maybe to look in a few different directions, or maybe to extend some threads that you have presented yourselves or have picked up on in other people's talks, to open up outward the conversation. And also, I should say, end notes. I don't know about you, but when I pick up a new book of scholarship, even though I don't tend to use notes myself, I always look for the end notes, because that's where the gossip is, and that's where delicate and polite people like Larry Buell actually express their true feelings in the notes, not in the main text. So this is an end note presentation. I should say, I don't typically use enchantment as an explicit term in my work. I was trying to tilt my presentation toward the theme of the conference, but as I'll say in a few minutes, I think of enchantment as a form of meaning, emotional intensity, engagement, interest, something good. And as Wendy said, much of this recent book that I published last fall with my father after a dozen years of playfully and happily toiling together focuses on insensitivity, on aspects of our own minds, the human mind, that prevent us from being adequately appreciative of the meaning of information. And where I'm trying to go now is toward forms of sensitivity. What can we be sensitive to? How can we take information that dulls and deadens us and give it some kind of enchantment or meaning? So this image on the screen, which I'll talk about a little bit later, some of you may recognize if you're familiar with the American artist who produced it. It's just, for me, it's an image of data. This is data. It's specific objects, and I'll explain in a little while, but it's also just, I think, really captures this notion of a sea of data, and what does it mean? What sense can we make of it? How can we begin to peel away the obliquity, the lack of transparency of that information? So one of the basic questions of the Numbers and Nerves project is, why are we highly sensitive to some information and insensitive to other information? So here we are in Europe. One of the major social issues of the day in this part of the world, as in other parts of the world, is the plight of refugees who are fleeing from terrible social crises in their home countries. And one of the salient examples of our astonishing insensitivity to information, and then how we suddenly wake up when the information is presented to us in a different way, is the case of the boat people coming from countries like Syria, particularly Syria, and how the images in the media affect us differently. So on the left is an image that was published in The Economist in April 2015, showing a capsized boat of Syrian refugees making their way to Turkey, and there's, I can't even count them, probably 30 or more people there. And this appeared in The Economist to very little notice, just one of many such stories, didn't pay any attention. And then on September 3rd, 2015, as surely most of you know, the New York Times published this image of one 3-year-old Syrian boy, Aylan Kurdi, lifelessly lying on the beach in his red shirt and his blue pants and his tennis shoes, and the entire world focused attention on this incident. And it actually had a very concrete response. This is just Google Analytics showing how people began searching for more information. You see a steady but low level of attention. The yellow line at the top is for searches for Syria. The red line is for the topic of refugees. And then the blue line refers to the boy Aylan Kurdi himself. Obviously, no one knew of Aylan Kurdi until this image was published. But there was a little bit of steady, flatlining interest in the larger topics. When that image was published, there's this huge spike of attention. The attention to Aylan lasted a short time and then dropped down. Now there are not a lot of searches for him. The information that we know is all we're going to get. But there continues to be ongoing heightened awareness and interest in gathering more information about the broader topics that Aylan is associated with. Also, Swedish scholars have studied charitable donations to refugees in crisis and have found that this spike and an ongoing willingness to give to the cause of refugees occurred in monetary terms as well. Scholars have worked with the Swedish Red Cross and other groups to chart that phenomenon of practical contributions. So it's actually now known as a phenomenon, the Aylan Kurdi phenomenon. I noticed, because I was tracking this last fall, that a book of scholarly articles was actually published approximately a month after the New York Times article and image, of people instantly writing articles about the meaning of that photograph and the public response to it. This electronic book appeared. So I'm interested, and this is part of what pulls this into relevance to our work together at this conference, in this idea of poignancy, or enchantingly moving information, and how it can have a powerful political effect and also can empower local individuals. What can we do to help people receive information in ways that makes that information poignant? Literally, what does poignancy mean? Refers to the evoking of a keen sense of sadness or regret, or a sharpness or pungency in taste or smell, comes actually from the word to prick. And when I think of that pricking or piercing, it reminds me of a phrase that the prominent American environmental writer Terry Tempest Williams used to use constantly. Every time I saw her in the late 90s, she would say, what we must do as artists, as speakers, as writers concerned about environmental topics and social crises, is to bypass rhetoric and pierce the heart. Some of you may remember that. It was almost it became, how should I put it? It was a mantra. We must bypass rhetoric and pierce the heart. And essentially she was saying her purpose as a communicator was to achieve poignancy. So I know many of you have offered very powerful and detailed analyses of artistic texts, particularly literary texts in different genres at this conference. I'm interested in literature and other forms of communication, not only because of their importance in cultural traditions and as aesthetic phenomena, but, and I hope this doesn't sound reductive and as if I'm squeezing the life out of literature, which I love and which I teach and have studied for many years, but I'm starting more and more to think of literature as being part of a larger phenomenon that I prefer to call information. And I see in the field of eco-criticism, perhaps more widely in environmental humanities, a movement toward information management as a mode of eco-criticism. How do we not just look at poetry and novels and beautiful artistic paintings. But how do we read the newspaper? How do we listen to the news? How do we talk to people about things that are happening in the world and gather that information and process it in our brains? So I see some of the work that I'm doing as being in line with that of these thinkers whose names I put up here. Many of you know Rob Nixon's work, of course, and you know the phrase slow violence. I use slow violence, the concept of slow violence, in my own work, but I'm particularly struck by the concept of apprehension. How do we apprehend the information to which we have access and make sense of it, make meaning of it, enchant it with this energy? Another scholar whose phrasing of information management first made me really think that, oh, well, that's what I'm doing. I'm looking at information management in this context, is Heather Hauser from the University of Texas, who published a book a few years ago called Eco-Sickness. But in American literary history, she did publish this article in 2014, Managing Information and Materiality in Infinite Jest and Running the Numbers. And she has a whole series of articles related to data and information, such as description as data in literary studies. So the phrase information management I attached to Heather in her work. And then Ursula Heise, another very prominent figure in contemporary American eco-criticism, has a brand new book out called Imagining Extinction, The Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species. Some of you may have heard her lecture or seen some of her articles on extinction in recent years, but she's interested in databases. How do we fathom and tease meaning out of databases, which seem to have no aesthetic quality and they're almost inhuman in their austerity and authority, and yet she tries to interpret them as cultural texts. So all of this is information management. So back to Numbers and Nerves, which I worked on with my father, Paul Slovic, who's a psychology professor at the University of Oregon, and one of the prominent figures in the field of decision-making, decision theory, and risk perception. So one of the founders of that whole discipline of risk perception. A few months ago, we gave a talk together at the University of Oregon right after this book had come out, and this picture was just before our lecture there. The lecture was attended by a handful of people from the humanities and hordes of people from the natural sciences and the social sciences, and senior university officials, the provost, people like that. Often in the humanities, we wring our hands and we say, well, nobody wants to give us money or pay attention to us. They think we're irrelevant, we're just decoration. It's not actually true. I think they're just waiting for us to say something they can use and to reach out to them in a way that enables our ideas to be functional and helpful. So I have found a tremendous response to the kind of work that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. And it just meant not just talking about poetry as poetry or art or beautiful photography as aesthetic objects, but as ways of processing and packaging information. So some of the key ideas, psychological ideas in Numbers and Nerves, include the idea of psychic numbing, which we didn't coin. It comes from Robert J. Lifton, who was writing about survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the 1960s, won a National Book Award for writing about psychic numbing, and has continued throughout his career to reflect on the meaning of psychic numbing. Sometimes it's a good thing. It enables us to survive in very difficult circumstances when we turn off our sensitivities. But often it makes us numb to information that we really should be appreciating. Pseudo-inefficacy is a psychological concept which gives us the feeling of helplessness. Why bother? You know, well, there are all these refugees out there, we can't do a thing. Our 10 euros, our 100 euros, won't even make a dent in the problem, so why do we even bother, and so forth. But in actuality, we can often have efficacy, but we tend to feel helpless and we're not inclined to help. The prominence effect, where we're weighing choices. We all know that plastic pollution is a terrible thing, and yet plastic water in plastic bottles is right here, and we're thirsty. So we drink from the plastic bottle, even though on a deeper level we understand the consequences of such behavior. Every day, all of us face that sort of dilemma, often with multiple choices. And how do we respond? How do we reach toward our higher goals, our long-term goals, when faced with these immediate choices in our lives? The prominence effect is a psychological paradigm or context in which we weigh these options. We don't rely on our gut response, our fast thinking, as Danny Kahneman, who's one of my father's longtime close colleagues, the 2002 Nobel laureate in economics, as Danny Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow, says fast thinking is the gut reaction, the intuitive emotional response to situations. Slow thinking is the rational, deliberative process. Too often we rely on the gut response and we don't stop and take a breath and think it through and walk to work rather than jumping in our cars. And so often we can make better choices between these options that seem to lead us in the wrong direction, and so forth. I won't go into all of these because I have some slides that I really want to get to in my limited time. The asymmetry of trust, though, the anesthesia of destruction, the way forces of exploitation, corporate forces and other such forces in the world, often they understand these concepts. They know how to numb people, and they spill data out into the world so that we don't react sensitively. It was Vandana Shiva, when I went to New Delhi to interview her for the Numbers and Nerves project, who spoke in interesting ways about the anesthesia of destruction as a strategy used by certain cultural forces. And if we're aware of this and other paradigms and other concepts, we might be able to control our own susceptibility to these paradigms. And then finally, the trans-scalar imaginary, which I'll emphasize in some of my examples in a minute. We need, in the 21st century, because of the wonderful access we have to data, we need to think in new ways. And we can use art, literature, other forms of communication as training devices to help us consciously evolve, as Robert Ornstein and Paul Ehrlich put it in 1989 in their book, New World, New Mind. We can train ourselves to think in more flexible, trans-scalar ways. Trans-scalarity, or the trans-scalar imaginary, is the term that visual artist Chris Jordan used when I went to Seattle to interview him about his work. So in addition, and this is part of this enterprise of reaching outward, we're having great conversations with each other these days. We publish books, we publish articles in narrow media, but I would say everyone in this room has the capacity to alter her or his voice in certain ways and reach out toward different audiences in other academic disciplines or to general audiences. So my father and I, who've worked for years within our specific academic fields, have recently been writing op-eds. And the very first one we wrote ended up in the New York Times in December. And part of the reason it appeared was that there was a timeliness to it. It emphasized the refugee crisis, but immediately reached around the world, and all kinds of people began thinking about psychic numbing, what's called the arithmetic of compassion, and responding to this piece. I love op-eds actually because you can sit down and write them in an hour. There are 800 to 1,000 words usually. I wrote another one which is coming out this summer in a big journal for environmental policy and science called Environment Magazine, and we currently have one that's circulating on what we call inadvertent genocide, the genocide we don't mean to cause, but which all of us are complicit with in our use of fossil fuels. And this one is currently at the Huffington Post. So back to the core of Numbers and Nerves. If we look at the mass, if I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will. This is common knowledge. Mother Teresa used this, and she helped thousands and thousands of people, but even she knew that she was susceptible to the power of singularity, the individual was more emotionally resonant than the collective. So a powerful, deeply unsettling insight into human nature. Most people are caring and will exert great effort to rescue the one whose needy plight comes to their attention. But as soon as we know that that one is part of a larger group, we become less inclined to do anything at all. So this is related to how we value a human life. You would think that every human life is of equal value. One life equals one unit of value. 2 lives equals 2 such units. Or, as the numbers increase, the value of the life should get even higher, because you could be facing the devastation of an entire community of people, or of bees, or the danger and the risk of losing so many lives means that there should be an exponential curve of increase. However, our feelings tend to be insensitive to large losses of life or large numbers of any phenomena that are at risk. So the reality of the way the human mind responds to units of information is that there's a radical collapse of feeling. And you'd think, well, yeah, of course, when you start talking about 1,000 individuals or 100, yeah, then maybe the feelings blur a little bit. It actually happens when we move from 1 to 2. Almost instantly, as soon as we start talking about a collective of 2, we stop caring as much, is what the psychologists have found in their research. So I'm not going to belabor this and go on at great length about the many different examples of our insensitivity, but what I'm interested in, what my father and I are working on now, is how do we overcome these intrinsic psychological tendencies, these modes of insensitivity? Well, by figuring out how to work multidimensionally with information. Again, this is something that many of us understand intuitively, and that writers and artists have also understood, but I believe it's helpful for them to have some language, some of these terms in mind, to know how psychic numbing works in order to sidestep psychic numbing or work through psychic numbing. So using images, using narratives, personalizing stories and faces, understanding the psychological processes by which we process information. One of these scholars who have worked on this for a long time is Edward Tufte, who's a statistical evidence guru. He's a sociologist, but he's now become much better known for his work in visualizing statistics or visualizing data, and has a number of books on this subject, and basically suggests that we need multiple dimensions of communication working together, not just lumping them all together, but strategically weaving them together in a thoughtful way in order to achieve salient information. But the 2 key points about achieving discourses of sensitivity, as I like to call them, is the singularity effect, what psychologists call the singularity effect. We place great value on saving individual lives or responding to other individual or small-scale phenomena. And then we must rely on processes of rational deliberation in addition to our initial emotional responses. We can't just react instantly and assume that our gut reaction is the true reaction. We need to do what psychologists like to call the dance of emotion and reason. We need them together. There's a reason we evolved to have capacity for emotion and reason. These work together, and they support our thinking and our decision-making in important ways. So, in a way, I'm getting to the punchline before I get to the examples, but as I said earlier, written language and other modes of communication can have dramatic impacts on audiences. Certain types of narratives are especially capable of achieving poignancy. One is the reduction of the large-scale phenomenon to individual phenomena or singularities. There's also the scaling up and often the fluctuating between large and small scales. And how we manage and communicate this fluctuation is vitally important. I would say also stories of vulnerability are especially piquant and sensitivity raising. We're moved by tragedy, by loss, by the threat that an individual might face. And also stories that reveal dramatic change or conversion of some kind are often particularly eye-catching to us. I really think of it almost as a visual thing, an evolutionary process by which we notice movement out of the corner of our eye, like a predator species, whereas we wouldn't notice stasis. So movement, change, captures us. So the idea that the individual might fill us with compassion and inspire action that otherwise wouldn't occur happens every day in the media. This is a famous story of a dog on a sinking ship, and people who wouldn't lift a finger to help a boatload of refugees, on the other side of the world, would contribute to an amount of $300,000 to rescue a single dog on a boat because of the singularity effect, this one individual that so moves us to care. So one of the other new dimensions of this field is called psychonarratology, where we study the relationship between the mind and texts, and particularly the way narratives are produced. This is an aspect of cognitive cultural studies. And there is a book from 2003 called Psychonarratology, Foundations for the Empirical Study of Literature Response. But we're really just in the beginning phases of empirical study of the way people respond to text. Much of it is still armchair response. And the authors of this book, Bortolucci and Dixon, complain about Wolfgang Ise, the founder of reader response theory, for being far too theoretical. People must respond to, the reader must respond in this way. He was interested in the reader, but he didn't actually collect data on the way readers react to information. So I have a little image up here from a talk that I gave in Poland last month, and this is the rector of the University of Wrocław playing an organ. Following my talk, he was moved to go into this music hall and play the organ. He was the host of the lecture, but the man standing next to him is Wojciech Małecki, young Polish eco-critic and pragmatist philosopher. He works on Richard Rorty and pragmatism, but he also works with interdisciplinary teams in Poland to run subjects on how they react specifically to animal narratives. And they've run more than 3,000 subjects and gathered data on how people actually react in relatively controlled circumstances to different types of texts. And that's what I aspire to do also, to actually run subjects and not just speculate so much or use myself as the exemplary reader, as most of us do. I react to a text this way, so everyone else must. So I think we're leaning in this more empirical direction. So just back to some of those modes of narrative that I mentioned earlier and other forms of communication that I think are poignant. Aldo Leopold understood this intuitively, and one of the reasons I think why Thinking Like a Mountain became such an important essay in the field of American environmental thought is that Leopold wonderfully uses images of vulnerability. He reduces a large ecosystemic phenomenon to the case of a single wolf, and one of the most famous phrases in all of American environmental communication is the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. One wolf, one set of eyes, dying, vulnerability. He's working exactly into these psychological mechanisms. And then he immediately scales up in the next paragraph. He doesn't leave it at that smaller level, but he's working in the trans-scalar imaginary and thinking about the effects of killing predators upon entire ecosystems. So when we have phrases like the ones I've been sharing with you in mind, we might better be able to interpret the communication strategies of someone like Aldo Leopold. Also, conveying vulnerability and reducing an entire species to a single exemplar occurs in the example of one of Homero Eregis's powerful poems, Ballena Gris, or Gray Whale, where he imagines a future where the dark shape of the whale is no longer sailing through the waters of the Eastern Pacific, and he turns to this whale and speaks apostrophically to the whale, saying, "Gray whale, show us the way to another fate." Some of you may know that Eregis is very involved in whale protection activism and in monarch butterfly activism, but in addition, he uses his voice to write articles for the media and to write poetically in a way using these techniques of singularity, vulnerability, and the sense of kind of an ominous future in order to enchant, as I say here, a future possibility with meaning. So the visual artist whose image was on my first slide is Chris Jordan, who's attracted quite a bit of attention among humanities scholars in recent years, and he's the one who used the phrase the trans-scalar imaginary when I was interviewing him in this room that I show in the slides. This is his studio in Seattle, Washington. He's an artist, but he mostly works on computers and does digital compositions and then prints them on this oversized printer here in his studio. And so often he'll use, and you can find his images at his website, www.chrisjordan.com. He will often use recognizable images from the arts, pointilliste paintings by Georges Seurat or Botticelli's Birth of Venus, or he'll use abstractions. But then there's always some data embedded in his imagery. So here's the Botticelli. It looks kind of like the original, but it's actually a digital composition. And when you walk up close to it and take a picture, as I did in the next slide, or when you click on it on his website, it moves toward you. It creates the effect of walking up and inspecting it closely. And you can't see very well in this picture, but there's a tear coming out of Venus's eye, and if you see a clearer image, it's made up of thousands of plastic bags. And so Venus emerges from the sea. The seas are being devastated by plastic pollution, and so Venus is crying as she emerges from the sea. The image on my first slide was Jordan's famous composition called Plastic Bottles, 2007. And he always shows the size of the original image, and then he always has statistics next to each one. Part of the apprehension of his imagery involves reading the statistic, looking at the image from a distance, and moving up close to it. So this image from a distance, you can recognize it from my first slide, it just looks like a clean beach of pebbly sand or something like that. It's kind of peaceful and beautiful. But as you walk up closer and closer to it, you see it's made up of 2 million plastic beverage bottles like the ones on our table here, the number used in the United States every 5 minutes in 2007. And Chris Jordan is a walking fountain of statistics. He's full of all this data, and he attempts to encapsulate it in imagery that is at once of aesthetic quality. It engages us, it makes us interested, and it's disturbing when you realize that what it encapsulates, like cigarette packages, like prison uniforms, like Barbie dolls, things like that. And so he uses his imagery to train us to think in a trans-scalar way. And in the interview that's in the book, he actually tells the story of standing in the Boulder, Colorado Art Museum with a friend who's holding a plastic water bottle looking at this image. And that's what this tells here. And his friend looks at the image, and then he looks at Jordan sheepishly, and then his head snaps back as he recognizes. Then he slinks away to a garbage can and throws away his bottle. And then he apologizes and said, "Well, that was just one bottle." And then he says, "But you're depicting 2 million one bottles." And so he actually tells the story of the way he imagines his work, not just this, but his other work, might have an impact on audiences and train them to think in different ways. Here's another one called Denial. And it's a little bit pixelated here in this image, but if you actually look at the original, it's less pixelated. It looks just like an Ansel Adams picture of this beautiful Nordic scene. And then you go up close and you see it's made of the little insignia for Denali SUVs. Except that it's been altered, and some of the words are Denali and others are denial. The fact that the vehicles we drive have a powerful impact on the places we love. So I'm moving toward an end here, but I wanted to talk, just in keeping with poignancy and enchantment, share with you a brief bit of music. We've occasionally talked about music at this conference, but I haven't attended any papers that I can recall about music. And for me, one of the more poignant expressions of change and the potential loss of a healthy planet is the music of Anthony Hegarty, who now goes by a different name, Anoni. Some of you may know Anthony Hegarty's work or the work of Anthony and the Johnsons. I was just driving across town several years ago, and heard on public radio they were playing his covering of Knockin' on Heaven's Door, and it was so strange and striking. I pulled my car over to listen to it and then began ordering all of his music before I realized he was an environmental musician. But in a lot of his work, in interviews with him, and even in some of his CDs, he's talking about the environment and a sense of planetary loss. And I think it's fascinating. Anthony Hegarty went through sex reassignment surgery in 1993. So he has, in a very profound material way, experienced change. He has lived change in perhaps the most radical way a human body can experience. And so when he talks about change on a planetary level, it resonates powerfully with me. Although he chose to become a woman in an elective, conscious, deliberative way, but we're not choosing the changes that are occurring on the planetary level, although maybe we choose by our behavior rather than with our minds. So there's one particular song called Another World, which I found particularly relevant and moving, and it's 5 minutes, but I just wanted to play about a minute of it, just so you hear his voice, and you can go online and listen to his music. So let me see if I can get this to work for you. I have it queued up to the right place, and I hope it will be loud enough. Is it? Can you hear anything? No.
I need another world. This one's nearly gone.
Maybe we can increase the volume.
Still have too many dreams, but never seen the light. I need another world, place where I can go. I'm gonna miss the sea. I'm gonna miss the snow. I'm gonna miss the bees, miss the things that grow.
So that gives you the brief gist. He refers to himself, or actually I was just reading today, the websites related to him or her have changed, and now she's calling herself she, and she's changed her name to Anani rather than Anthony. And so this particular song emphasizes missing, loss, absence, our planet becoming a planet that we might not wish for. And so I think this sense of loss, the way he individualizes it and places it in the context of, or she thinks of it in the context of her own desire and lack of desire, I think achieves this poignancy that I'm talking about. Another brief example before I wrap up. Some of you may be aware of the 2015 Nobel Prize winner for literature, Svetlana Alexievich from Russia, or from Belarusia, who is most famous for her work, like Studs Terkel, the American writer, for collecting stories of individuals and then powerfully representing these individual cases rather than writing collectively about survivals of Chernobyl. She tells numerous individual stories of Chernobyl survivors, or soldiers who fought for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and have had lasting bad effects on their lives as a result of that experience. So I want to conclude actually by talking about another way of reaching out from our own conversations with each other, which has to do with the way we use what we know to empower other people. And I'm specifically interested in enhancing bioregional sensitivity and sensibility, and using environmental testimony projects to raise awareness within communities and then to speak outwardly to other people in faraway places. So some of you may know about testimony projects. This phenomenon really came on my radar in the mid-1990s when Stephen Trimble and Terry Tempest Williams produced very rapidly, within a month, a collection of short writings by prominent writers from the American West about the need to protect wilderness in the southern part of the state of Utah. They printed 1,000 copies and they hand-delivered them to all members of the senior United States leadership, the House and the Senate, the President and the Vice President, and fighting to protect a place that was immediately threatened. And in fact, after they declared the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, Bill Clinton waved a copy of this book and said this made a difference. So this idea of marshaling a group of voices, calling attention, and raising awareness of the human meaning of this place. Many other testimony projects have happened either through formal publication or informally. Sometimes teachers have their students visit an important place, perhaps an endangered place, and write a group of writings and then self-publish such a book. This is one produced by one of my graduate students over here, Corey Lewis. And then these are published by Milkweed Editions, an important American publisher related to Alaskan wilderness. In the early 2000s, a national park ranger from eastern Nevada, Roberta Moore, contacted me and asked if I would help produce a Nevada wilderness testimony book. So we spent the better part of a year gathering testimonies, not just one-sided protect the wilderness testimonies, but a variety of very personal perspectives on wild places in the state of Nevada in the American West. Contributors included the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, Harry Reid, who's a senator from Nevada, and Corbin Harney, who was the spiritual leader of the Western Shoshone, and other native people, some of whom didn't like the idea of wilderness because it prevented them from going to places with their cars and taking their grandmothers and their grandchildren to these remote places. So it was a multi-voiced collection of writings. We've heard from the University of Nevada Press, we don't really get the statistics about sales because we donate all of the proceeds to a Nevada Wilderness Organization, but it's one of their best-selling books, partly because it's a nice small book that people can buy for holidays and give as presents, but it's a collection of testimonials that raises awareness of the value of wild places in that state. So a few months ago when I was in Guam for the International Conference on Island Sustainability, I was interested in how it might be possible to raise awareness of the jeopardy that island cultures are facing throughout the Pacific. I didn't know too much about it when I went there, but it struck me that the plight of islands in the Pacific was somewhat like Dr. Seuss's famous story of Horton Hears a Who, where this elephant is splashing around in a pool and hears very faintly with the big ears, there's someone out there, and maybe my behavior is threatening to that someone. It turns out there's an entire civilization of tiny beings called the Whos who live on a speck of dust on a flower. And as soon as Horton finally hears these voices, he's aghast and says, I must stop splashing in the wild way that I was splashing. And I have this feeling that if we were more sensitized to what's actually happening to thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people living in island cultures, not only in the Pacific but in other parts of the world, little dots in the middle of the ocean, we might respond differently. So the inadvertent genocide op-ed that is circulating right now is on this particular subject. One of the speakers at that conference was Tony de Bruym, the recent foreign minister of the Marshall Islands and the representative to the COP21 negotiations for the Pacific, and who's talking about the fact that the Marshall Islands may be the first nation that may be eradicated due to climate change. He says vulnerable countries should not be treated in a one-size-fits-all manner. There are different realities, different actual physical and social conditions in each place. They have unique vulnerabilities. And he said, people elsewhere in the world think of us as insignificant dots on the map in the middle of nowhere. Indeed, that had been my impression till I actually visited Guam. And I've never been to most of the islands that speakers at the conference were from. There are more than 2,100 of these places. It's not an insignificant number of places or communities. So when I was in Guam, in addition to giving a talk, I led a one-day testimony writing workshop, environmental writing workshop on the beach. And I had 25 people. Many of them were environmental scientists. Some were university students or teachers. Most of them did not think of themselves as environmental writers. They were primarily from Guam. Some were from other island communities. And basically, in one day, I sought to immerse this group of people in the concept of environmental writing, to look at short examples, to read them aloud to each other, to do short exercises in describing the physical place where we were doing our work. And then also, finally, the culminating exercise of the day was to give them an hour or so to have them write 1 or 2 pages about some important issue or concern that they had in their communities, environmental or social. And so they wrote 250 to 300 words. They included a bit of story. They described the landscape or the seascape or other individual encounters with phenomena or people, briefly articulated arguments, sometimes combined with story, and they tried not to be overly abstract, but to accentuate the local and the personal. Some of them wrote about overdevelopment, such as what's happening in Palau. Others wrote about mega typhoons they had been experiencing recently, problems with lack of resources and waste management in Guam. This is what Guam looks like. You think of it as a green tropical paradise, but they're suffering terrible drought right now. This is on Mount Lam Lam in Guam. These are the students writing in the environmental writing workshop, producing this collection of testimonies, which we plan to post on the Center for Island Sustainability website at the University of Guam. So I think it's actually critically important for us to recognize not only the vulnerability of people on island communities and refugees and other such people out there in the world, but to understand that we are all island dwellers. We all live on Earth Island. An acute appreciation of our islandness and our own vulnerability, I think, will enable us to go forward in our lives and do our work with a greater sense of urgency and a sense of the meaning, rather than leading to despair and throwing up our hands and just feeling helpless. I think the more powerfully and beautifully vulnerable we recognize our own conditions to be, the more effective we can be in our work. So, and I have found, just my own little empirical experiment, when at the end of my lecture in Guam, I had one of my students, a slam poet and a very articulate undergraduate from the University of Guam, come up and read her testimony, which she did in both Chamorro language and English. And people were sufficiently satisfied with my comments, but they were much more impressed with Ariel Lowe's eloquent presentation of her own personal experience. And I see that she has gone on from this occasion and actually posted her testimony on Vimeo. So if you just search for Ariel Lowe Invasion, you can actually hear her with a flower in her hair and kind of presenting this, and find some other powerful presentations of her work. So what I've presented to you, this is my last slide, is an example of an interdisciplinary project, a project that attempts to pragmatically marshal some of the understandings from psychology and apply them not just to textual analysis, but to the experience that we all have as we encounter data in our lives and attempt to tease out the meaning of that data. So we are all in this together, not just the people who've already participated in the Numbers and Nerves project, but I think certainly to me that's a takeaway from our conference. We're all working on comparable activities. When we hear echoes of each other's work in each other's papers, it's a good thing. It means there's some consonance and some potential to work together on these projects. And I just want to conclude by thanking you for your good work, for being diehards and still attending the conference at the end of the meeting, and for your attention. Thanks a lot.